Welcome everyone to the second webinar in the new BALLE Live webinar series on Local First. My name is Alyssa Barron-Mensah and I serve as Managing Director at BALLE. We have several dozen communities from across North America registered for today's webinar, and we're delighted to have you with us and dialing in as I speak. I'm going to review a bit of housekeeping, provide a few reminders about the webinar series, and then we'll introduce our topic and speaker for today. So if you're dialed in by phone, but you've not joined us in the webinar room, you can find a link in your reminder email from Ali Walker. Because of the number of webinar participants, we have the phone line muted. So if you have a question for the presenter at any time during the webinar, you can type that in the public chat window. Kimber may answer a question during her presentation, but we'll hold most questions to the end of the webinar when we have time set aside for moderated Q&A. If you have technical difficulties at any point, you can note that in the chat window, and our staff member, Ali Walker, will send you a private chat to help you get it sorted out. The private chat shows up as a new tab to the right of the public chat window in the top right corner of your screen, which flashes red once the private chat has been initiated. After each webinar, we email everyone registered a link to a full recording of the webinar along with presentation slides and a copy of the questions from the chat. So you can watch for those materials in an email from Ali Walker over the next couple of days. So this series, our Local First webinar series, features innovative strategies at the level of individual businesses and networks of businesses that effectively make the case for local and result in more buying and thinking local first. Each webinar is focused on tools and strategies you can take home and try out right away. We know that driving demand for local products and services is a critical piece of building the localist movement and taking Main Street mainstream. Locally produced goods and locally owned businesses have received a surge in support and in awareness over the last several years, growing over the past decade, thanks to many of the Think Local First campaigns across North America that many of you run. We'll continue to support this movement by showcasing models, campaigns, policies, and programs that expand ownership and shift purchasing towards local first. So as with all our webinars, we suggest you treat these calls as an opportunity to bring together a group of business owners, local economy conveners, local funders, and other supporters in your community who are interested in the topic. After listening to the webinar, you can spend some time discussing with your group the applicability and relevancy to your community. To leverage the impact of our webinars, we highly encourage these viewing parties and roundtables, and you'll never have to pay extra per attendee on the same webinar line. So starting this month and continuing into 2013, I'm very excited that we are doing a deep dive on local procurement as the next generation of local first work. In the United States, as much as 6% of GDP comes from the spending of anchor institutions. So our consumer-focused local first work is still critically important, but it's only a piece of the potential hundreds of millions of dollars in buying power we can be directing to local enterprises. For example, a model we'll feature in 2013, Source Detroit, has already redirected $17 million in spending to local businesses in Midtown Detroit in just a few years of working with 3 anchor institutions. So over the coming months, our Local First Procurement mini-series will bring together tested models, strategies, tools, and pioneers to help all localist communities begin to advance the local purchasing and procurement as a part of the city's economic growth strategy. Next month, we'll feature the learning from Cleveland about partnering with anchor institutions to create new businesses, support existing businesses, and create jobs. We'll hear the critical role the Community Foundation, in this case the Cleveland Foundation, has played in advancing this work, and we'll talk about how you can partner with community foundations in your place to advance procurement. So for full details about our series, including topics for upcoming webinars and a link to registration, you can go to our website, bealocalist.org. So today we're starting with government agency procurement. So I'm very delighted to have Kimber Lanning with us today. She's the Executive Director of Local First Arizona. She's a BALLE Fellow. She's a BALLE board member. And she's an entrepreneur and economic specialist who works to cultivate strong, vibrant communities and inspire a higher quality of life throughout Arizona. And we're going to hear today about the work over time that Local First Arizona has done that's resulted in a change in the City of Phoenix's procurement policy to favor locally owned businesses and help build a regional directory of certified local business vendors. So with that, Kimber, I am going to turn it over to you to get started. I've given you the floor, and you should now be able to advance your slides.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully I'll be able to give you some information you can use in your communities. I'm going to share a little bit of the background of how we got here and the steps we've taken to have the positive impacts that we've had. And I'm also going to talk to you about some of the obstacles that we faced, how we dealt with them, what you can expect, and some of the failures as well. And then just kind of wrap up with where we are today. And consider myself available if you have questions that run over today. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how we decided that procurement was going to be one of our main focuses. The organization technically started in 2003, but we didn't officially become an organization until 2006. That's when I formed the board of directors. And at that time, we already had 800 members. The organization was really just a database, and it was free. And all the way back at that time, we were hearing from tons and tons of locally owned businesses that were losing contracts left and right. In the environment at that time, there were a lot of procurement officers as well as city managers that just had in their minds that cheapest, and I'll put cheap in quotes there, cheapest was always best. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to combat that. But we were overrun by companies who were losing contracts, and we started to dig and do the research, and we identified this as a key area that we felt we could make an impact. So in 2007, we commissioned our first economic study, which is called Procurement Matters. The only study group that I knew of at the time in the country was Civic Economics. We had read the study they had done in Austin, Texas. So we reached out to them, and they were very interested in taking on our study. And I'm going to highlight that study for you in just a moment. That study really was critical, and it was a turning point for us to be able to get press and to clearly and accurately demonstrate that the existing purchasing procedures were failing schools, they were failing cities, counties, and the state across the board. So in 2008, we created our first Senate bill, and we thought this was going to be a slam dunk, naively, and we had a lot of opposition come out of the woodwork. One of our main opposing institutions was the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, and through several meetings with them, we were unable to come to any sort of agreement. And they sunk our bill in year one, so they put a bunch of lobbyists against us, and we really didn't know what hit it. So we were naive. First Senate bill attempt, we didn't really understand how everything worked, and so we were just kind of standing there with a smile, and we just got slammed. 2009 is when we first introduced this to the city of Phoenix, the changes that are currently just now being implemented this year. So it took 3 to 4 years of yes, we can do this, and even getting it through the mayor and council before it actually grew teeth and is being implemented, and I'll share that with you as well. 2010, we did our second economic study, which is in the slides coming up. 2011, we created our second Senate bill, which was a much better attempt. We actually made it through the Senate unanimously in year two, but again, too much opposition came up, too many lobbyists pounding on the representatives, and so we decided not to run it in the House. And the same thing happened in 2012. Again, we made it unanimously through the Senate. We had about 75% estimated support in the House. And another group popped up, the Arizona Contractors Association, and they have 16 lobbyists. Their problem was not with the concept of the bill, but rather our definition of a resident bidder in the bill, in the language of the bill. We will be able to come to an agreement with them. However, we didn't have enough time, quite frankly. They popped up in opposition the day before we were supposed to go to a vote. And it's always smarter to pull your bill and not go down on a bad vote. And since we have one lobbyist and they had 16, we decided it would be smarter to come back this next year, which we're preparing for now. In 2012, earlier this year, is when the City of Phoenix policy change has actually been implemented and enforced, and they're actually working with Local First Arizona on populating a database. So that kind of gives you the timeline. I put this in here because I want people to realize, to recognize how much time and energy to expect going into these types of political change. Anytime you have a policy change, it isn't going to happen overnight, and it's constantly pushing boulders, multiple boulders up a hill simultaneously to get these kinds of changes implemented. So I talked to you a little bit about why we started. The number one reason was so many of our businesses were losing business. We have one of the most fantastic, it's actually a B Corp here in town called Goodman's Office Furnishings. And they had just lost the major City of Phoenix office furnishings contract to Target when Target just bought out Walsh Brothers a few years ago. They lost that contract, and that was one major thing we were looking at. We also have the Tempe-based company that held the city's contract for towing, which is a massive contract, lost it to a company in Chicago. And I could go on, and these businesses were reaching out to us in frustration, and the stories we were hearing were everything from procurement officials not understanding the true value of locally owned businesses to flat-out corruption. So the stories are unbelievable, and I will write a book one day. Bad local business climate, just not enough support for local businesses. Generally, big companies looking out of state first because they didn't either know the talent was here, they didn't understand the value of local economy. Huge, huge learning curve around the education for local economies. When I put leadership with low self-esteem, I say that jokingly, but in all honesty, we lack the leadership to stand up and say, we're going to change this. We just kept saying, but if we use too many of our local businesses, or if we preference our local business, then nobody's going to want to do business with us. And so learning how to counter such ridiculous claims is part of what your job would become. Lack of vision, I talked about political lack of vision. Just this city in particular was built on a short-term leadership. We are a real estate boom, and that means that people are used to coming in, making a lot of money, and moving out. And there's not a whole lot of people who put a flag here and say, "No, we're going to do business the right way, not the cheap short-term rewards path." Also, I think that you should consider this. There was no one operating in this space here in Arizona. There was no one stepping up and questioning the way this was done. And it was truly a rude awakening for our procurement offices, because it was like, upturning a rock and finding a bunch of bugs scurrying to the side. And I'm not even saying that lightly. That's what it was like. These people had not been audited. Their work had not been scrutinized, and they were rudely awakened when we came in with blaring bright lights, and we uncovered a lot of questionable activities, and we had to be careful with that, because sometimes when you make enemies with the very folks you're trying to get to change, the change actually takes longer to occur. And we definitely approached this by building a case. We wanted to make sure that we had facts and statistics to back everything up. We never, and you'll need to pick up your own language, but we never took the approach that we should have sympathy for the small businesses, we should have empathy for the small businesses, or the small businesses have rights too. Never, ever, ever had that language here, because it would have fallen on deaf ears. We simply talked about the economics and job creation behind it. So part of what I would urge you to do if you're interested in working in this space is considering the landscape where you live. First of all, you need to do the research to figure out what your city or state's current policies are. Some of you already have preference. Some of you have preference in certain industries. In Alaska, fishing and certain things related to the ocean are all favored and weighed toward Alaskan companies, but nothing else is. That's just a simple example. You can find this research usually on a city or state's website. And if you can't find it there, you can usually call a procurement officer to point you to the right direction to figure out what their current policy and procedure is. They legally have to post it somewhere. Find out who the big local companies are that have lost business to out-of-state companies and form a team around you. Find those, we have a steering committee that we put together that has everything from office supplies to office furnishings to forensics to contractors to I know there's more. We have a large group. Everybody that came out of the woodwork to talk to us. Oh, architects, that's a big one. Local talent like architects and engineers, they lose tons of work to out-of-state companies that may or may not be more qualified or less qualified. It never comes down to that. The big out-of-state, this is more important now during the recession because the big oversized companies are they are hurting for work, and so they're bidding on much smaller projects across a broader geographic space, which means we've got massive companies with hundreds of architects bidding on small jobs here in Arizona, and that's causing our small and mid-sized companies to really struggle because they're competing against California companies that are 5 times bigger and have more resources. So look into that kind of research. Choosing the right language for your area. I know certain areas that are much more progressive and or liberal, they can handle words like preference. I happen to be in an area that's very conservative, and a word like preference is an automatic hot button, you'll create enemies right away because the right tends to believe that any kind of preference is anti-free markets, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about how we're going to address that, or how you should address that if you run into that. But I can't underscore enough. I do not talk about in most of these audiences. I certainly don't talk about love, but I don't talk about what I call touchy-feely stuff. I know about building better communities and making people feel connected to place, and there's a certain place for those conversations, but not in the language around procurement. You have to stick, in my community, you have to stick to job creation, economics, competitiveness. All of those words work, whereas preference and anything having to do with we should do the fair or right thing, forget it. It falls on deaf ears. So understand who you're speaking to and use the language they want. And think about who your strategic allies are. If you're working with a city, find some councilmen or aldermen who are supportive of this concept and align yourself with them. Let them take credit for things. Do not feel like, I can't believe that he was on the news talking about procurement and didn't even mention us. Don't feel that way. You want to be able to take success stories to your political leaders because they will go to bat for you. And also I think I would recommend finding allies on staff wherever you're going to be working. See if you can find anyone that is sympathetic to your points. Take them to coffee, meet them for lunch, and just find out where they're at. Find out how resistant they're going to be and see if you can win any of them over ahead of time. Most likely you're going to have to not expose a staff person publicly, but they can be a great ally in terms of giving you internal information. There's also lots of business organizations, business leaders, and even sometimes the city chambers can be very supportive. The thing to watch out for is so many of the chambers are inundated with the big international corporations, and therefore they can be resistant if their bigger chambers get wind of it and they think they're going to lose out on any business. So you have to be very well aware of that as well. So this is a map that I created to give you an idea of, this is about a year and a half old, so some of this may have changed. But to give you an idea, the red states have both a tie bid preference for resident bidders and a reciprocal law, and I'll explain what that means. A tie bid preference is pretty obvious. That means that if you're doing business in Colorado and you bid on a contract and it comes in, all things being considered equal, as a tie with a non-Colorado company, that means it automatically goes to you. That's how Colorado operates. And with the red states, they either have a law like that or they have a reciprocal law, which means, let's take New Mexico. In the state of New Mexico, if you're a resident bidder bidding on a state contract and somebody from Colorado, let's say, actually California is a better example, if somebody from California bids on that contract, California has a 3% preference for all of their businesses. So that means that in New Mexico they would say that the California company has to beat our best guy by 3% or more in order to win that contract. Other states have as much as a 5% preference. In that case, New Mexico with the reciprocal law would say you have to now beat our best guy by 5% or more. So the red states in this map have both of those laws in place. The blue states have either or. And again, this information is not too difficult for you to find. You can go online to your city or state websites, search for procurement, and this stuff has to be posted. If anybody would like me to follow up with an email, the Texas State Procurement site actually has a public directory listing of what all the other states do, and it's really easy to have a broad overview to put together facts and statistics for your particular state or argument. So one of the things that I do here in Arizona is, for whatever reason, we have a lot of political leaders that look up to Texas. And so when I can say that for 11 years Texas has had tie bid preference, a reciprocal, and they also have a flat out preference, and they've done this for 11 years, and that really gets people's attention because they think, well, if Texas is doing it, I mean, that's the #1 economic development state in the country. So again, learning that language, doing the research, and figuring out how to apply those arguments at the right time is really important. As you can see, with Arizona being one of only a few green states, we desperately needed this. And so I made this visual because people were not understanding. When I would say there's only 3 or 4 states that do nothing, all I have to do is put this up on the screen and people will gasp. But if I just say over and over again, we're not doing anything for local business, it doesn't resonate. All the other states are doing it, it doesn't resonate. This resonated. I mean, I could get an entire audience to gasp when they see how far off the mark we are. So now let's talk about our first economic study. Again, this was the Procurement Matters study done in 2008. We chose the state of Arizona's $5 million office supply contract. We chose this to look at because we have 3 very distinctly different types of office supply companies here in Arizona that we could compare for purposes of this study. So we hypothetically applied the $5 million contract to all 3 different types of businesses. The first one being WIST, which is a 3rd-generation Arizona-based company. Excuse me, they are based in Tempe, and they are big enough to handle a contract of this size. Excuse me. The second is OfficeMax, obviously a big national retailer, and they do have a regional distribution center here in Arizona. The third company we compared is Staples, which is obviously a big multinational, but they do not have a regional distribution center here in Arizona. So we were able to compare the 3. These pie charts that you're looking at, I've probably showed these pie charts to at least 50,000 people in my slide presentations. I speak publicly about this stuff on a regular basis. These pie charts that you're looking at represent the rate of return. So had we spent $5 million with WIST, $5 million, or of the $5 million, 33% of it would have stayed here in Arizona, and for the same $5 million spent with OfficeMax, only 11.6% remains. So the methodology, and I'll show you Staples in the next slide. The methodology that we use in our study is the first thing we did is we compared jobs, and we discovered that WIST has 100% full-time employees with benefits. And we also discovered that OfficeMax and Staples have brought Arizona 62 to 63% part-time employees with no benefits. So we can demonstrate that those part-time employees with no benefits end up on the state health care program. And we can show that their prices are not cheaper, it's just deferred billing for the state. So sure, they could lower their prices, but the state is picking up the health care for the majority of their employees, and therefore, if you measure this even over 1 year's time, it's a loss. It is definitely not cheaper. The second area that we're looking at is charitable contributions. WIST gives $35,000 a year to Arizona charities and has done so every year for the last 10 years and can prove it. Staples nor OfficeMax had ever given anything in Arizona that they could point to. So that was a very significant differential as well. The third is what we call second-tiered jobs. This is one that has really resonated with folks, and it may in your community as well. WIST does business with Arizona. So they have Arizona accountants, graphic designers, web developers, payroll service providers, and we could prove that. Staples nor OfficeMax does any work here at all. No jobs, no goods or services sourced locally at all from either company. So those dollars immediately leave. So when you consider the long-term impacts of a $5 million contract, this is the pie chart that shows the actual rate of return. Staples, without a regional distribution center here, they actually pack and process our orders in Los Angeles and ship them to Phoenix, the Phoenix area via FedEx. So we spent $5 million and we didn't create one job. So we were able to take this study and we showed it on the Senate floor. We talked to enormous companies here throughout Arizona, and we've been able to successfully get them to think differently about the value of the money, the value of the contracts they're awarding, and whether or not what they think is the cheapest price is actually the cheapest price. Then we decided that, okay, now we've browbeat everybody and we've had this sort of feather-ruffling conversation. Now we decided that we needed to do an economic study that was positive in nature. So we looked at SCF Arizona, and they are the state's largest workers' compensation insurance company. And we got into their books and we looked at what they were doing with their money. They make it their mission to buy locally. Their board is supportive of this. Their staff is supportive of this. They talk openly about how important it is to buy locally. So we hired a company to dig through their books, and we had two key findings that came from this study. The first one was that the amount of money they spent $100 million, but we proved by the time that money had recirculated in the local economy that they had created a $500 million positive impact, the multiplier effect. The second thing we discovered is that they directly employ 518 people, but we proved that because of the way they award their contracts, that they indirectly support 3,600 Arizona jobs. So if you can see, these two different studies approach the same issue from two different angles. One is to show how much we're losing and how ill-equipped we are to deal with measuring the true value of a contract. This study came in and said, wow, these people have already figured it out. Look at the positive impact you can make if you choose to buy locally. And so this resonated with an entire different group. One group had resistance. Oh, we've done it this way. We're going to continue doing this way. We don't want to hear it. This group that resonated with this went, wow, maybe we can make a difference. Suddenly you've got the procurement guy sitting in an office somewhere thinking, wow, maybe I could have a really positive impact by the way I'm doing my job. And my language has shifted around that as well. Whenever I go to speak to procurement folks, I talk to them about how much of a positive impact they could make and that how much recovery in Arizona depends on them. And that has really helped a lot. This statement I use a lot in my slides. We're buying ourselves broke. Getting folks to think about how we're spending our money. I know that many of you out there do this every day, but this piece of it is incredibly important. Finding the language to help people understand that cheap is definitely not the cheapest. We came up with a slogan called "Cheap is costing us a fortune," and that one has really resonated as well. Cheap is costing us a fortune. I also think it's important that you make sure that you find statistics that you can pepper your slide presentations with, your talks with, to help people understand the true state of the world. Your community is not alone in this battle, and that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who are working hard to change the way we do business to create a wider prosperity for all. I really believe that, if you go in, no matter what language you choose for your community, helping them understand that you're just a piece of a much bigger issue, a much bigger struggle. Hey, we don't have to each reinvent the wheel. Look at what everyone else is doing. Do your research, figure out what other communities are doing, and share that as much as you can over and over again. I also think it's important to talk about economic gardening in your community, to think about, to reposition how we are talking about the difference between large and small companies. And bringing in an institution like the Harvard Business Review into your presentation and your discussion about this to point out perhaps that your economic development team in your community does not have the latest statistics, does not have the latest information, and needs to be brought up to speed on what is happening elsewhere in the world. So most recently we had our biggest success story is with the City of Phoenix. Like I said, we originally got this through Mayor and Council in 2009, only to find out that staff couldn't care less. And staff's general attitude is, to the elected official, you're going to be gone in 4 years. I really don't care what you think. I'm going to continue to do my job the way I was trained to do my job, and I'm not going to be thinking about all this other nonsense. And also, you guys are just a bunch of talking heads. You politicos, you don't even understand procurement. You just want to go out there and get the votes by saying, I'm going to strengthen the small business community. So not good enough to just get your electeds on board. You have to get staff buy-in, and that's when the rubber hits the road. When we got staff buy-in this year, through a number of different happenstances. One is a huge corruption was uncovered on a deal that happened at the airport that landed on the front page of the Arizona Republic, which that spurred putting together a task force to do a review of how they were procuring goods and services and what the process was. And I was fortunate enough to be named to that committee. And after a series of surveys and studies, it became apparent, the more I was around them, the more I was able to talk to them, that there was a willingness to rethink the way they were doing business. So to give you an idea of what you're looking at on this slide, the way the old model was with the City of Phoenix is there used to be a $5,000 threshold in place, and any contract worth more than $5,000 used to have to go to a full open public bid. And again, we do not care where you're from. We do not care what kind of jobs you create here. We only care who's cheapest. And we got them to understand that that is not a good way to do business. And we raised that threshold to $50,000. And now any contract worth less than $50,000, staff has been completely retrained. They go to a database that we're helping them populate with certified local vendors. So anything under $50,000, they get 3 bids, they go with the lowest, and they're done. They go to this database. So I'm able to look at the super conservative folks and say, hey, this is still a competitive process. This is not a preference. We are estimating that this is going to do, not we are estimating, the city is estimating this is going to do 90 to 20 million new additional dollars in local business in the next year. Now our new incoming mayor is so supportive that he actually upped the ante a little bit, and he has offered to make this a regional directory, and he has tasked me with going around to all of the communities in Maricopa County and offering them two things. One, to work with them to get their businesses into the database, so it's not just Phoenix, it's Scottsdale, Tempe, Glendale, all the surrounding areas. And number two, to actually give the car keys, so to speak, to their procurement office so that they have the ability to utilize the same database to find local retailers. So I'm in front of different mayors and council almost on a weekly basis to have this conversation about how they can utilize the system. We're bringing in procurement folks at all different levels to help them understand and help them get trained on using this system. So county-wide, this could literally have a really, if it's 18, 19, 20 million in Phoenix alone, that means we could be looking at about 100 million over the next year if we can get as many as 13 different cities on board. So that's huge. Last couple things I want to go over, the arguments you can expect. Resident bidder preference will open the door to corruption. Don't ask me why. This is one of the number one arguments you hear. And this is like, this is going back to horse and buggy days where we didn't have this thing called the internet. But to me, it's absurd to think that two guys here in Phoenix would have more likely have a higher option of opportunity to be corrupt versus somebody coming here from a neighboring state or a brother of a procurement officer that lives in Maine. It could be anywhere, it could be anything, and to believe that having local businesses participate in the procurement procedure opens the door to corruption to me is absurd. And so I've been able to shoot that down time and time again. Again, go out, find examples, do the research. There's a belief that it's too regulatory, and I believe you can easily argue that we're not talking about creating additional regulation. We're simply talking about using the correct measuring stick to measure the true value of a contract versus just the price. We're not introducing a new level of regulation. We're just changing the way we view the value of a contract. Another argument we hear regularly is that somehow that this is anti-free trade, and I will just point out repeatedly that every Walmart that ever got a $25 million subsidy flies in the face of free trade. Right here in Phoenix, we have a Bass Pro that got $32 million. We have a Cabela's that got $68 million before they even opened their doors in subsidies. Tax abatement, that flies in the face of free trade. All we're trying to do is create a level playing field, measuring the true value of the contract. We are not asking for favoritism. We are not doing anything that is anti-free trade. I beg to differ. Everything that just happened with the banking industry was anti-free trade. Will cause out-of-state businesses to stop bidding on our contracts. We've heard that a lot. Again, low self-esteem. All you got to do is point out all the other states that are already doing this, and that goes away. Will cause other states to retaliate. Never, ask anybody who throws that one up if they can find one incident ever in the history of the world of a state that retaliated because a neighboring state decided to measure the value of their contracts differently. And I've never, the last point there, will cause businesses with out-of-state headquarters to leave our state. Again, absurd, paranoid language there. Can't point to any of it. All you got to do is turn it back on them and say, can you give me an example of what you're talking about? Because I've done the research. I've never heard of it. Never heard of it even once. Amazon barks really loud about things like that, but they don't actually do it. The last thing I want to hit on is just being prepared. You got to be prepared for it's not going to happen overnight. Do a lot of one-on-one meetings. Find out who your allies are. Find out who you can trust, who can be there in the long run. Form a steering committee of business owners who understand this language firsthand. I think it's important. One of the things I did is I sat down, as I mentioned, the Arizona Chamber was in opposition, and meeting with them and all of their committee heads as well. I think that's a really important thing to consider. You have to just be prepared for meeting after meeting after meeting. And I'm proud to say that whenever I go into a meeting with a committee, a chamber committee that's opposed, at the least I can move them to neutral. I may not be able to get them in support, but I can at least move them to neutral by fending off all of these illogical fears. Be prepared for waffling and lying. Your state legislators, they are going to go with whoever is going to apply the biggest pressure or whoever has the biggest lobbyist. It's good to check in with them regularly. You can't, just because somebody said, yeah, I'm behind you 5 months ago, does not mean you can count on it today. I highly recommend that you get cozy with chiefs of staff, because they're the ones who will say, oh, Senator so-and-so called and is trying to talk our guy off of our team. They'll be the ones, staff are going to be the ones that tell you where the dirt's coming from, who your opposition is, because they're the eyes and ears of those offices. Be prepared for misunderstandings. There's going to be a lot of folks who don't know what you're talking about, and they're going to make instant knee-jerk reactions like the anti-free trade comment. It's a cheap comment that's just thrown out time and time and time again, and you just need to be prepared for that. Got to have flexibility. Don't get too emotional. When you have to pull a bill off the floor after you just worked on it for 6 months, it's like a punch to the gut. But it happens, and you got to keep a smile on your face and just know you'll be back next year. And also keep in mind that if the bill that you end up with, we've had to go through several revisions. We had to accommodate this group over here. We had to change this. And at the end of it, you might feel like, well, this bill is watered down. You know what? It might be. But if you can get it passed, you can go back later and add amendments to it much easier than having this huge debate on the Senate floor. It is much easier to get a text amendment through later after the fact, and you can fix it and repair it. That's how this stuff works. So if it's not perfect, don't think it's the end of the world. So I think that is all I have. And so with that, Alyssa, I'd like to hand it back to you, and maybe we could go through some questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kimber. We had one clarifying question, and just in case you haven't made this clear as you continue to speak, the local preference legislation has passed in Phoenix, but it's not statewide.
That's correct. We have not successfully changed the statewide procurement policy. We are going to reintroduce it again this year with very few changes from last year. We're just going to have to change our definition of resident bidder to accommodate the Arizona Contractors Association.
Okay, great. Well, I'm struck by this, Kimber, that you learned so much along the way that it almost feels like one just at listening to you almost imagines that you came in and you were just really smart about policy in the first place, and you must have done something like this before, because you seem like a force of nature when you talk about it. But I know you've said to me that no, you just kept figuring it out as you went along, and trying the next thing. But I thought it might be helpful to hear you speak to that, to anybody who's feeling like, okay, this is incredibly powerful information and visuals and stuff I can use, but it feels a little scary to wade in.
Sure, and that's a great question. And one of my favorite sayings, for anybody that doesn't know me, my background is that I'm a small business owner. I've owned a record store here in the Phoenix area for 25 years. And so my response to your question really is I'm a record store lady. I have no background in this whatsoever. I did not understand the legislative process when I started, much less, didn't know how to write a bill or how to get a bill launched. I relied on, I just asked a lot of questions. I went and found people who do know the legislature, and I asked them what the procedure was, and I've learned as I've gone. What you find out is that when you get a senator that likes your idea, their staff will help you draft the bill. So all that fancy, funky language, I didn't come up with that. The staff did. So, and then I took it and brought it back to a few trusted people, and we poured over it, and we made the determination if it accurately represented what we actually wanted. So I really, really, Alyssa, underscore that anybody can do this. You just have to be really determined.
Great. I think that's helpful to understand because it seems so impressive now that you've gone through all of this learning. But you just waded in and you found some allies along the way. So I think that's really helpful to just hear you speak to. So we have a question here whether either of the studies looked at the overall economic impact or job creation impacts of local procurement. So were they specific to well, we'll just leave it at that. So you can see it in the room here. Did either of your studies look at the overall economic impact or job creation impacts of local?
Overall, no. So the first economic study, Procurement Matters, specifically only looked at office supplies. We have never attempted something as massive as overall procurement. I honestly don't know what kind of an undertaking that would be. It would be massive. We're talking billions of dollars of expenditures. So no, the quick answer is no, we have not. We tackled a specific sector of procurement because we thought we could make a better case.
And interestingly, with the studies, the two studies focused on specific businesses and kind of the compare and the contrast in specific sectors, it sounds like that's given you the data, enough data to work with to really make the case.
Yes, I believe that it has. Partly, these studies both took less than 5 months to complete, and I think sort of time is of the essence. If you get bogged down in a study that is just too massive to complete in less than a year or two, you're going to lose your moment. So I think it's important to stick to a certain area in your community that is, number one, familiar. Everybody understands office supplies. You don't want to pick something too bizarrely obscure, like even something like forensics might not win over as many people. But office supplies, everybody gets it. Everybody understands Staples and Office Max. So familiarity is important in choosing, what you're going to be studying. So yes, I think that a smaller, pointed, well-targeted study can go a long way.
And how much did your studies cost? You said they each took less than 5 months to create. What did it cost, and how did you fund that?
The first study was approximately $17,000, I believe, and gosh, it's hard to remember, but I'm pretty sure it was about $17,000. We funded that partly through our general funds, partly through a small little, me making a few phone calls asking for small contributions, and partly WIST, the office supply company, contributed heavily to that study because they simply wanted to know the answers. The second study with SCF Arizona funded that study as well. We were able to be the mediator between the group that was hired and SCF Arizona. So we did not have to raise funds for that second study. They believed, as they still do, that it benefited them tremendously. They are big proponents of local business support, so they recognize here's a way that we can win some of our colleagues over, but also this is going to make us shine, which it did. And that study in particular has gotten our big utility company to shift 10% of their spend. I mean, millions of dollars of shifts have occurred because of that, because of their, I think it was $7,500 investment. That second study was much less. It was about $7,500 because we were only looking at one company rather than three.
And I'm struck here that you have focused the studies on larger local businesses, but after you get some of these policy measures in place, businesses of all different sizes might actually benefit from these contracts. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. So we'll say the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back with the Phoenix City Council was only a $15,000 contract for screen printing. So the City of Phoenix had to get new City of Phoenix T-shirts made for staff, printed, screen printed, and the contract went to a company in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And the reason they gave us was that they couldn't find an Arizona screen printer. And I said, well, that's really interesting because I could pretty much stand in the middle of the road anywhere and hit a screen printer with a rock that could use a $15,000 job right about now. So that's the reality is tiny business. I mean, a $15,000 screen printing job is a good-sized job, but that's a small company. That could be a company with only 2 or 3 employees.
Okay. Let's see here. So, one thing I think it'd be helpful to talk a bit about and get your sense about is not just the kind of language to use around, preferences versus, other ways of encouraging local procurement, but potentially the work of organizations like WTO that are coming out. For example, I think it's I'm forgetting if it's in Ottawa, someplace. Maybe in Ontario. Maybe Amy from Vancouver will know what I'm talking about, or somebody else will, and pipe up in the chat window. But I know the WTO has been going after a larger city that has a preference in place, and saying that it is indeed anti-free trade, such that we should be conscious as we're looking for all sorts of different strategies to encourage local procurement, including with government agencies, that we should be conscious of the language, but also what's happening in the legal landscape. Are you familiar with that? Do you have anything? Okay, I see here. There's a WTO challenge in Ontario because of their preference for green energy companies to be local and buy local parts. Do you have any thoughts about this, Kimber?
I have not been following that. What was the answer that was typed up?
Amy in Vancouver has shared there's a WTO challenge in Ontario because of their preference for green energy companies to be local and buy local parts. So it sounds like it's a local preference regulation for green energy companies, and those companies being local and buying local parts. So it's in the realm of things that we're talking about. But local preference regulations are just one strategy for encouraging local procurement. And I noted, Kimber, that you said something where you said, we can still show in Phoenix that it's a competitive process. Right.
Right, and that's why I really the solution we came up with in Phoenix. It's not a preference. It's simply we change the procedure, and then we still have a competitive process. So that I think has enabled us to win accolades as willing to compromise and also just strategic thinkers as an organization, that we came up with a solution that pretty much silenced the naysayers who were worried about having free markets. Unfortunately, I do not know enough about what's going on with the WTO or what their argument or opposition would be to really comment on that, and I apologize.
Oh, well, and I didn't necessarily expect that you would. I think this is something as a community that as we keep digging into procurement that we can be aware of, and we can be developing talking points. But I think part of this, the points that you're making, Kimber, great. So Amy's now posted in the chat window an article on the WTO ruling. So there's a piece of this which is about perception and about languaging and being very clear that there's plenty of very anti-free trade procedures that are already very common. Michael Schuman and I did a study, I guess 4 years ago now, that looked at 15 rural states and looked at economic development programs in those states and found that in most cases 95% of economic development programs and tax abatements and subsidies and all sorts of other incentive programs, 95% of those funds were going to out-of-state companies. Versus the in-state companies. So there's certainly all sorts of preferences already on the books in most of our communities for transnational corporations. So that seems like a critical point to underline. And then we'll just keep watching the space around preferences and how they stand up. But in your case, could you speak a little bit more about when you say you change the procedure so that you could still have a competitive process? What do you really mean? How does it work?
I'm sorry, Alyssa, you asked me how does it work when we change the procedure?
Right. So what does it mean that you change the procedure but still have a competitive process?
Sure. So we don't have a law that says the city must preference local business. What we have is a new website that's populated only with Arizona companies, and staff has been retrained to use that website to find companies to solicit with their requests for proposals and bids. So we changed the procedure as opposed to actually having a law to force them to do that. So it's been up to them to retrain staff, and because we have more staff buy-in, they're actually doing it. And we're seeing that city-to-city support, which I mentioned earlier. We're seeing more cities that are collaborating with each other and sharing that database.
Okay, great.
I want to go back. There was a question earlier on from Kyle. The website for the Texas company is civiceconomics.com. civiceconomics.com. And also for Anthony's question, I wanted to clarify the job creation impacts in the SEF study were noted, even though they're not overall. We did note clearly that because of their local sourcing, while they employ only 518 people, we proved that they're indirectly supporting 3,600 jobs. So it's very easy to parlay that into the importance of local purchasing in the job creation and certainly job retention fields. So I just wanted to tie that in for Anthony.
Great. So I see a question. We've got just a couple more minutes, but there's some more questions coming in. Are they allowed to seek for businesses outside of that database?
Only if they can't find 3 bids. If they can't find 3 companies to participate in the bid, for example, if they find 2, then they're allowed to go outside for 1/3 bid. If they find 1, they're allowed to go outside for 2. But what our goal is, and they're being receptive to this, is to heavily populate that database so that it's rare if they have to go outside of it.
Great. And Kelly says, is the database available for other communities to use? And I imagine, Kelly, you mean the database that Arizona is building out?
The database is available to any communities inside Maricopa County. Yeah, but that's it.
Great. And so would it be something that other communities could get in and actually look at as an example of how you've set it up? Or is that something that outside of your county they would just need to talk with you or a collaborator to kind of understand how it's been set up?
Yeah, if anybody would like to learn it, you can't access it, but I could put you in touch with the gentleman here that controls it. His name is James Scarborough, and he's been very receptive to talking to people about how it works and how they're creating it. So if anybody's interested, I could send out that contact information.
Okay, great. And Kelly's followed up to say also, is the technology platform you're using to build the database, is that something that's available for other communities to use?
You know, I don't know, but James Scarborough would be the person. So I'd be happy to introduce Kelly to him to find out if they would be willing to make that available.
Okay. Okay, I'm just typing his name in the chat window here so folks can remember who to ask for. And one clarification, Kimber, I think Kyle, when he asked, do you have the website for Texas, you were saying that the state of Texas actually has a comparison of what all different states do. And that, and I think folks were excited to find that website, and I couldn't find it on a quick spin through the Texas State Purchasing site.
I would be able to find that. It's been 5 or 6 years, but I'm certain I would have a link for it, and I can send it to you to share with the group.
Sure. So if you can find that, that'd be wonderful, and then we'll include it along with the call notes and the recording. We can include it right in that email.
Okay. I'm typing it right now to see if I can find it.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to do a couple closing reminders, and then if you happen to magically find it right away, Kimber, you can pop it in the chat window, and otherwise we will include it in the email that goes out. So after each webinar, again, we email everyone registered a link to the call recording, which you can use to show others and have viewing parties after the fact. We'll give you a copy of Kimber's slides and a copy of the questions from the chat window, so you have access to those links easily. So watch for that from Allie Walker over the next few days. You can purchase our webinars individually, or you can buy 3 at a time across any series for a 20% savings. So just a reminder, again, also you can host roundtables and bring as many people as you want with one registration. And for our BALLE leader members and champion members and the business affiliates of champion members, like all those businesses that are members of Local First Arizona, we keep our webinar conversations going through our BALLE affinity groups. And so you can connect with your peers based around topics of shared interest like Local First. So if anybody is a leader member or champion member and not already participating in the Local First Affinity Group and you would like to, then you can send an email to Martin on our staff, martin@balocalist.org. And let's see here, Kimber, I see you've got the main overview page and another couple of links. That's very helpful. You found it right away.
I did. I love Gmail.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Kimber, for sharing your time and really breaking down how you've worked over time to get to where you are now.
Of course. Thank you all very much.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll continue exploring more models and approaches for working with hospitals, for working with government agencies, for working with universities, from food to retail to service contracts, all sorts of different models over the coming months. So we hope to continue the conversation with all of you. And thanks again, everyone, for your time. And thanks to you, Kimber. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you. All right, you too. Take care.